Shopify is a platform built for growth, whether you're just starting out or already running a thriving business. From managing inventory to creating a seamless checkout experience, Shopify is designed to handle it all. And it doesn't stop there. Shopify helps you sell everywhere your customers are, online or in person. It's the ultimate tool for turning big dreams into big wins. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/OPP.
Mochi Health is here to help you start your weight loss journey with caring, personalized support. Meet one-on-one with board-certified obesity doctors and registered dietitians who truly listen and understand your unique needs. Eligible patients can access affordable GLP-1 medications delivered right to their door each month. No insurance? No problem. Mochi Health accepts FSA and HSA, making care accessible and affordable. And with 24/7 customer service, you'll never feel alone on your path to better health. Get started with Mochi Health today. Take the free quiz at joinmochi.com and use code AUDIO40 at checkout for $40 off your first month of membership. That's joinmochi.com with promo code AUDIO40.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, we talk about a woman who suffered unimaginable tragedy on September 11th. Or did she? This is the case of Tonia Head, the woman who wasn't there. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, your host, and I'm joined today, as always, with a lawyer who never loses her appeal, Alice.
Hi, everybody. This is Alice. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm excited today because I don't know if there's a difference in sound quality right now because we are currently recording, but I have a new microphone thanks to my wonderful brother. As a good brother who knows much more about technology than I do, he was listening to the podcast and realized that I was recording in my closet and that I might not have a quality enough microphone since all our podcast equipment is at Brett's house. So thank you so much, brother. I really appreciate it.
Family love. We're just bringing people together, bringing families together here on The Prosecutors. Thank you to Alice's brother for his contribution to our podcast. It'll be interesting to see how it sounds when we all get it finished and edited. So, you guys are hearing it first. So we'll find out. So today we have, it's funny, when we did Elisa Lam, we had some people who were like, hey, you guys should do a case where crime actually happens, being kind of, backhanded at us, saying that we were wasting our time. Well, today we're also going to do a case where arguably there was no crime, but maybe there should have been. This is the case of Tonia Head. So, Alice, do you remember where you were on September 11th, 2001?
I remember clear as day. I remember the time it happened. I was still in high school at the time, and I was changing because I was on a team, and so I was going into the locker room, but I was the only one in the locker room because of the way my schedule was. And I walked into the locker room, and the TV's always on in the locker room, and it was on silent. And I remember seeing the towers burning, but I had to rush to get to my next class, and I kind of saw that there was fire. I didn't recognize what it was, that it was the World Trade Center. And I wasn't that familiar with New York City at the time because I don't think at that point I'd ever been to New York City. And I remember running to my next class, my first period of the day after changing. And I walked into the room slightly late, which is why I was rushing. And the entire room was silent and everyone's eyes were trained on the TV. And that was a class that the TV was never on. And I remember stepping in and all of a sudden my skin just prickled up because I knew something terrible had happened, but I didn't know what. What about you?
Yeah, I was in college at the time. I'm a little bit older than Alice. Beauty before age or something. I don't know. Anyway, I was in college and I was in my dorm room and I was sitting on my bed because I had just woken up. And I was thinking about that day I had my Russian literature class and I actually had a paper due in the class that day. And my girlfriend, who is now my wife, walked in and said, "You need to turn on the television." So I didn't really ask any questions. I just turned on the television and who knows what channel it was on. It didn't really matter. And as soon as it comes on, it's an image of the World Trade Center. Both towers by that point had been hit, so they were both on fire. And then very shortly after that, it flashed to Washington and you could see smoke rising in the distance. And I remember saying something like, "That looks like where the Pentagon is." And it turned out it was. And then, of course, very shortly after that, you had the next plane, which crashed in Pennsylvania, or was crashed heroically in Pennsylvania. And I remember going to class, and obviously, I still went to class, but there were no classes. People were just sort of sitting around, and the professors were kind of, acting as counselors for people. And I just remember there were all these rumors about how there were more planes on the way, and there were planes coming across the Atlantic that we had lost contact with, and that jets had been scrambled, and they were going to shoot these planes down, and nobody knew, how many people were dead. I mean, there were people saying there were 10,000 people dead already, and it was just, it was a horrific day. And the crazy thing, I think about this sometimes, that there are people in college now who weren't alive when September 11th happened. And it's hard to believe that it's been that long. It's hard to believe it's been 19 years. Next year will be the 20th anniversary. And how much changed and the consequences of that day and how they continue to reverberate throughout then. Well, one person who definitely should have remembered where she was on September 11th was Tonia Head. And the reason I say that is because she had a remarkable story, the kind of story that, is so amazing and so incredible and so tragic that it's hard to believe it's even true. Tonia Head was on the 78th floor of Tower 2 of the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001. When the plane struck that building, the explosion blew her across the room, injuring her severely, almost ripping her arm off, burning her arm. In a documentary, she talks about how they were watching the tower burn next to them, and her fiance, actually her husband, was in that tower, and she was counting floors to try and figure out whether or not he was above where the plane had hit or whether he was below where the plane hit, when all of a sudden they saw this plane coming towards them. But miraculously, with the help of some real heroes that day, including Wells Crowther, who's known as the man in the red bandana, she was helped through the smoke, through the flames, and her life was saved. She managed to make it down the stairs with the help of some others, and then as the tower was falling, a fireman grabs her and throws her underneath a fire truck so that she's not killed by any of the falling debris. And her story is so striking. She talks about how there was one man who was obviously dying, and he asked her to take his wedding ring and return it to his widow. There's Wells Crowther, who saved her life and then lost his own. And then her husband, Dave, who worked in Tower 1, who was also killed that day. Fact of the matter is that Tonia Head would have been one of only 19 survivors who had been at or above the point of impact when the planes hit that day. If I recall correctly, the second tower was hit and there was one stairwell that wasn't severed, and so people could make their way down. In the first tower, both stairwells were severed. So if you were above that point, you had no chance, no ability to survive. But Ms. Head was a survivor. And so through this horror and through this tragedy, she emerges as the leader of the 9/11 Survivors Network. And she comes to represent the group. She actually becomes the president of the group. She meets with people like Rudy Giuliani, Mike Bloomberg, George Pataki. She's featured in articles about 9/11. And she gives tours of Ground Zero and tells her story. And in 2007, she invited filmmaker Angelo Guglielmo to make a documentary about her and the Survivors Network, of which she was the leader. And then, in the middle of this documentary that's being filmed, everything falls apart. Everything I just told you is a lie. It turns out that Guglielmo, he got a far bigger story than he could have bargained for. Head hadn't been in the towers that day. She hadn't even been in New York that day. Her first trip to New York was in 2003. Her arm injuries were from a car accident that had happened years before. The entire story that she told was a fabrication. And all of it is recounted in a documentary called The Woman Who Wasn't There that came out in 2011. And I think if it came out today, it would be an absolute sensation. I mean, we're in like the golden age of documentaries, but I bet a lot of you don't even know this story. But The Woman Who Wasn't There, it's something you should check out. It's on Amazon Prime. You can watch it for free. And despite the incredible nature of this story, it's one that I've personally never heard discussed in a true crime podcast. So it's something we wanted to talk about with you today.
Right. So let's go through the timeline because this takes place over several years. So as you know, 9/11 happens. Now, Tonia joins the Survivors Network. It ultimately becomes named the Survivors Network in 2004. And she is a sensation when she joins it. People look to her for leadership. She has such an amazing story. You know, other survivors say things like, she's been through so much more than me. I feel guilty for even feeling, any sort of sadness or anxiety from 9/11. Within a year, in 2005, Tonia takes over the Survivors Network as the president, and she's chosen to lead tours of Ground Zero for dignitaries. She is shaking hands with the leaders of New York and other countries as well. In another year, in 2006, she is featured in a 5-year retrospective article about the survivors who escaped the burning buildings. Then the next year, in 2007, is when everything came crumbling down. The New York Times starts calling people, including Tonia, and before long, they figure out that her entire story is a lie. She's a sham.
And, Alice just mentioned that she became the head of the group. If you watch this documentary, which Alice and I actually watched together, I've seen it several times. It's amazing. You've got to watch it. But she not only became the head of the group, she actually essentially organized a coup and overthrew the person who founded the group. And he just ended up leaving. And you watch the documentary and you can just see the pain this guy's going through, where he's trying to figure out, what did I do to alienate all these people who helped me get through the survivor's guilt, through the nightmares.
And it's so ironic that there's so much angst in what should be a support network. And this often happens, I think, at the little p politics. But you see the hurt, even though he's interviewed years later about it, how he feels betrayed and also guilty if he did anything to bring this upon himself. But what we come to know is it's really Tonia's doing to bring him down.
And I think, not in Tonia's defense, but it's very interesting when you watch this podcast, the way people talk about her. And I think to some extent, she really had a vision. She had a vision for what she wanted this group to become, that she wanted it to be more than just a group of survivors who could talk about what they went through. She wanted it to be something that did do things like lead tours through Ground Zero, that was the face of the thousands and thousands and thousands of people who either lost loved ones in 9/11 or were in the towers that day, or were the first responders who have dealt with so many health issues and everything else in the days that followed. And she had this vision, and I think it inspired people, and it made them want to follow her. And I mean, it's truly remarkable how much she was able to dominate this group and dominate the lives of the people in it.
And people who were affected by it. I mean, we spoke about how she said she was saved by Wells Crowther. Understandably, because Wells lost his life, his family wanted to meet her. She met with the family and actually was asked to speak at Wells's memorial service. Ultimately, she said she was too emotional to speak, but someone read her statement while she was at the memorial service.
Yeah. I mean, can you imagine? I think the thing that's so fascinating about this story, and there's a lot of things that are fascinating about it, and we're going to talk about those as we go on, but just the gall, the absolute lack of shame, the willingness to show up at that guy's memorial service. I mean, just say you can't go, or say it's too difficult, or, send your regrets, but to actually show up and to take some of that moment away from him and his family is remarkable. Now, having said that, the documentary interviews Wells's mother, and she talks about how wonderful it was to hear this story that she told about how Wells, did save her life. And so, I mean, Wells is a hero, and he did save people's lives. So I guess it was nice. I don't know how many of the other survivors they have contact with or not that he saved. But it's just the whole psychology of the thing is something that you could sort of sit around and ponder for a very long time.
And you really can go sit around and ponder it, because in this documentary we've been referencing, they interview Tonia a lot. This was for the 5-year anniversary, and she talks about her experience. It's quite convincing. I wouldn't have known, I don't think, if I were just talking to her about her experience, because she describes the heat on her body from the fires that were burning around her. And she describes in painful detail, what she inhaled into her lungs and what she sees with the pain around her and the screaming. So that's what's fascinating to me, is she talks a lot in this documentary.
And her story about Dave, Dave, her husband, who worked in the other tower, and how they met, how they were both coming out of the towers at the same time, and it's pouring down rain, and there's one taxi, and Dave is gonna get the taxi, and she thinks he's stealing the taxi, and so she gets really mad at him, and he's like, why don't we both take it? And that's how they meet, and they fell in love from there, to the point where after Dave dies, they're going to the 5-year anniversary, and all the survivors are down there in the footprint, and they're leaving mementos behind. And she has like a little taxi cab, and she tells the camera, I leave this every year here to remember Dave and how we met and how we fell in love.
Whew. But it's not real. So who is Tonia Head then? First of all, her name's not Tonia Head. Her last name is Head, but her name is Alicia Esteve Head, and she is from a prominent family in Barcelona. And that family actually was involved in a 1992 financial scandal for which her father and brother served prison terms. So you may say that she has a legacy of fraud. And she attended the University of Barcelona and worked for Hotel de la Via Olimpicia, which is a Spanish hotel company. And she later worked in Barcelona as a management secretary from 1998 to 2000. Then she enrolled in a master's program in Barcelona in 2001. And she was actually in class when the September 11 attacks took place in New York City. So not only was she not in New York City, she wasn't even in the United States at the time of the attacks.
Yeah, Tonia's real story, the story she would tell if she was telling the truth, probably isn't that different from the one you told, Alice, or the one I told. She was in class with her friends, with her classmates, when somebody said, hey, this terrible thing has happened, or someone turned on the television and they watched it happen. But she wasn't there. She wasn't in the tower. In fact, it's likely she had never even visited the towers up to that point. And Alice talked about how she came from a prominent family. She was wealthy. She came from privilege. She was used to being the center of things. She was the youngest daughter in a family of several children, all of whom were boys other than her. And she was doted upon, and she got everything she wanted. And then her family goes through this crushing scandal when it turns out that her father and her brother are involved in some sort of financial fraud. And as we learned in the documentary, this was a huge blow for her, and it was a blow for her ego, and it probably meant that she wasn't the center of things at that point. And you kind of wonder if she spent the rest of her life trying to return to that place of prominence. So as Alice said earlier, all this fell apart in September of 2007 when the New York Times decided, look, we've all seen them. I assume they still do it, but pretty much every year you would have an in-depth story going into the lives of some of the survivors, the people who've lost their lives, the firefighters and police officers who charged into those buildings and then died. There's a lot of people to talk about. And every year, the New York Times and everybody else is looking for somebody. And at the 5-year anniversary, obviously, Tonia was featured in a lot of different retrospectives on September 11th, but she wasn't in the New York Times. And the New York Times takes their job a little bit more seriously than maybe some of the other publications she was involved with.
What's interesting is other survivors are interviewed in this documentary. A lot of them say they felt guilty to even try to verify her story. They didn't want to be Googling the people she was referencing in her story because somehow by even looking to verify her story, they were doubting her. And it was almost as if they were thinking, I don't want my story doubted. So I wonder if Tonia kind of benefited from this desire not to verify, because to ask to verify meant doubt. But as we see, the lack of verification is what leads to this massive lie.
That's a great point, Alice. I didn't really think about that, but I think you're right. I think probably even a lot of reporters felt that way. I mean, who would lie about this? Number one, right? Like, why even think that? And to, ask somebody to verify the details of their horrible story is almost insulting. And so you can see why you wouldn't want to do that. And you're right. And one of the most striking interviews in the documentary is with a guy named Brendan, I believe. And he talks about how he listened to this story and it was just too much. He just couldn't believe that all this could have happened to her. And so he started kind of, looking into it, essentially in the middle of the night, alone in his room with his computer. And he's Googling Dave, and he finds out Dave does exist. And there's all sorts of articles about Dave. People love Dave. But in none of these articles is Tonia mentioned. Tonia, the love of his life. Tonia, the person who he proposed to in Hawaii after surprising her with tickets to Hawaii the night before, dressed in a hula skirt. I mean, Tonia tells this story about how she comes home and there are rose petals, and the rose petals lead to the dining room where he's in a grass skirt and he's dancing to Hawaiian music, and he's made all these Hawaiian dishes, and their tickets leaving the next day for Hawaii, and they fly to Hawaii and they're married in this sunset service on the beach in Hawaii. It's just like this incredible story.
And even more incredible, though, it wasn't an official marriage in the sense that there were no marriage documents because it was so whirlwind. And conveniently, he dies before they're able to officially be married by the state of New York. And Tonia actually gets a judge to marry them after his death. Because remember, I don't know if she's an immigrant in this life as Tonia Head.
Yeah, that's a question. You asked that while we were watching the documentary about what her immigration status was and whether or not this marriage would have benefited her in that way, which is something we can talk about in a minute. We talk about sort of the criminal aspects of this case, but it doesn't seem like it. It doesn't seem like she was here illegally or this allowed her to get a green card or anything like that. It just seems like it's part of this story that she's telling where, like you said, she's thought of everything, right? If anybody asks, well, where's your marriage certificate? Oh, well, this was a ceremony from the heart. It wasn't an official thing. We were supposed to go to the courthouse the next week or whatever and get it, made official. And then he died. And then, like you said, this incredible story, which I don't even know if it's true, that a judge married them posthumously.
I feel like you can't do that. Can you imagine that any dead person can just be married off without knowledge from their family? I've never heard of that happening. Just think about it. Think about the fraud that could happen.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, honestly, I just don't know.
She tells that story, or she tells that story to many people. Many people recount it, but we actually don't know. We have not verified that she in fact got married after the fact.
Yeah, and I don't know. And the other thing is, I don't even know why you would do that if you had the ceremony that mattered in your heart. What's the point of making it official with a judge later on?
For either immigration status or money.
Right. Yeah.
Anyways, that was a tangent, but
but it's a tangent that goes to just how complex this story was. And so Brendan can find no evidence of this. He can't find any mention of her, despite, the posthumous marriage or whatever. And so he starts to doubt, and he starts to think, maybe she's just a really good liar, but he doesn't tell anyone his suspicions because she's so powerful and she's so loved in the group that he knows if he says something to some of these people about this, he's out, and he can't risk that because he needs this group. For him and for the people who had actually experienced the horrors of 9/11, they needed this group. This wasn't some sort of vanity project for them. This is therapy that's getting them past suicidal thoughts and survivor's guilt and the horror of living day to day with the memories of what they saw and what they experienced. So throughout the rest of the documentary, he's just sort of commenting on how when it all started to fall apart, he's like, yes, somebody has finally figured it out. But it's really interesting that, he doesn't say anything and these other reporters don't look into it. But when the Survivors Network is contacted by the New York Times, the New York Times is like, hey, we would love to have someone from your group to feature. They're like, well, Tonia Head, obviously. Who else? And the New York Times basically performed some very basic fact-checking. Very basic stuff, like she says that she has a degree from Harvard University and a graduate business degree from Stanford. Those are easy things to check. They try to check it, and neither institution has a record of her. She says she's working at Merrill Lynch, and I think she even says that when the attacks happened, she was leading a meeting at Merrill Lynch. Problem is, not only does Merrill Lynch not have a record of her employment, they didn't even have offices in the World Trade Center at the time of the attacks. And this one's always struck me because she was so careful about so many things. And then, she knew where Dave was. She knew where he worked. She knew what floor he was on. She knew about Wells and the stuff he had done. But she didn't check to see whether or not Merrill Lynch had offices in the World Trade Center. I guess she just assumed. But in any event, the New York Times now has serious questions, and they keep calling her and trying to set up an interview. And she schedules these interviews and she cancels them. And she does that over and over again. And finally, she just says, I don't want to talk to reporters at all. And then at this point, the New York Times is starting to contact the Survivors Network itself. It's starting to ask questions of them. And Tonia decides to get a lawyer. The people in the Survivors Network are like, Tonia, just talk to them. Just give them some proof. One of her very best friends in the group is like, just tell them the name of the firefighter who saved you. Oh, that's all you got to do is just tell them that. And she wouldn't do it. And
the reason she asked her to tell the name of the firefighter is because everyone else conveniently in Tonia's story dies except for this firefighter.
Right. He is the one person alive who can confirm this story. He is the missing link. He is the loose end that Tonia never tied up. And all you got to do is tell his name.
You've pointed out some of the lies that the New York Times are beginning to discover. And these are big lies. She doesn't just claim to have a degree. She is naming world famous universities, Harvard and Stanford. She works for Merrill Lynch, not just some small company. I mean, these are massive, world-renowned institutions that you would think it would be easy to fact check. But for some reason, this is many years later, and the New York Times is just now beginning to discover that these institutions have no record of her. And I know some people listening may think that sounds almost too fantastical to believe, but let me just give you a small snippet of my experience when I was at Yale. There was a girl at Yale when I attended who was a student, except she wasn't. And it took an entire semester for people to realize this.
Wow.
She claimed that she had deferred for a semester. She lived with 2 or 3 other law students from the law school. We all knew her. She hung out. She claimed that she was working for a professor for a semester. She was writing a book. This is a very Yale law student thing to do. And so she was taking a semester off to write this book with a professor. And so she was always in the building. She went to lunches with us. She came to Bar Review, which is a weekly outing at a different bar on Thursday nights. She was involved in all social aspects of the law school, including living with other students. And then it fell apart when she didn't pay her rent to her for a month, and she suddenly disappeared. She couldn't be found. Her roommates needed her to pay rent, and they couldn't contact her. They couldn't find anything. So they went to the registrar to ask for her parents' information so they could contact her parents, because they were kind of worried about her at this point. She wasn't answering her phone. She was delinquent on bills that she hadn't previously been, and they couldn't locate her. So they went to the registrar to look for information to contact her family. And that's when they found out that the registrar had no information about this person. She did not attend our school and was not deferred for a semester, as she had claimed. And that lasted for an entire semester while I was at school.
That's insane. So she lied to her parents too?
She did. So I think what ultimately happened is she didn't get into Yale. And instead of telling her parents, she pretended to go to law school. I don't know what her end game was.
That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. I mean, other than Tonya.
I feel like it's almost like go big or go home. People might start suspecting if she claims she just went to universities no one's heard of. So she goes all the way up to the top to Harvard. And then she works for Merrill Lynch, not some small company no one's ever heard of, but one of the largest companies.
Exactly. It's the big lie. I don't remember if it's Stalin or Hitler or Mao or one of those mass murderers, but said something like, if you're going to lie, make it a big lie. I have a story similar to that, nowhere near as crazy as that, but maybe equally stupid, maybe more stupid. I don't know. I had he was not a friend. I would not call him a friend at all. I actually didn't like him very much, but he was in law school with me, and we started together and we graduated together. So he goes off to work at some big law firm. And the way it works is you graduate from law school and then you take the bar the summer after you graduate. And you actually start working for your law firm before you get your bar results back. And so that's like a very stressful time for you because you don't want to fail. Some firms have never had anyone fail the bar, so you don't want to be the first person. But you're sort of working under this, I know there's some like exception to the rules where if you're working under people who have a license and their process of getting a license, you can. But in any event, towards, the end of the year, bar results start coming back. And when the list comes out, the way they do it is they issue a list of the people who pass, right? So it doesn't say who failed, it just says who passes. And when that list comes out, his name's not on the list. So the firm calls them in and they say, hey, it's okay. This happens. It had happened at this firm before. Not a big deal. Keep your job, but just focus on studying for the next bar. Don't even worry about, working on cases. Just focus on the bar, take it next time, pass it, and we'll be golden, right? So, he's making the starting salary at that time for a first year law associate was $160,000. So he's making $160,000 a year, probably plus a bonus. So the next bar comes, he takes a few days off to take it, comes back to work, months pass, the bar results come out. He's not on the list. So he's failed the bar again. Well, at this point, I'm not exactly sure how they found this out, but in reality, he had not failed the bar those 2 times. He had never taken the bar. And the reason he had never taken the bar is he didn't actually graduate from law school. He had messed up his calculations and nobody caught it, and he was 1 credit short of graduating. So instead of writing a paper for a professor or something to get this one credit. He just goes on and acts like he graduated and starts working at this law firm, making $160,000, and just never tells anybody. And so obviously at that point he gets fired.
Why not just take that one credit?
I know. That's all you got to do is just take the one credit. Yeah. That firm actually ended up collapsing in the 2008. So maybe that was because they had really bad. But the thing was, at the time, and I don't know if it was like this for you, Alice, and I don't remember if you worked at a firm or not, but nobody ever asked me for like a diploma or grades or any proof whatsoever that I had graduated from law school. I was in the same spot. It's just the bar results came out. I had passed the bar and we move on.
That's a really good point you make right there. In cases I've worked on that involve fraud, often a question that is asked after the fact that fraud has been committed is, did you try to verify? And so many times, even in very professional industries, people say, no, I just trusted. And while that may sound silly to an investigator after the fact, I think about things in my life. You're right. No one's ever asked me for my diploma. I actually never even got an offer of a job to clerk for my judges. It was over the phone and they said, why don't you start this day? And I moved my entire life across the country on a phone call and have no proof that I actually got that job.
Yeah, that's a good point. Of all the jobs I've had, I've probably only had an actual offer letter maybe 2 times, 3 times. It's always been just sort of on your word, and the people who hire you just assume you have whatever you have. I mean, usually in the government jobs we have, they will often ask you for some sort of confirmation of various things. But yeah, a lot of times they don't. A lot of times the assumption is you just wouldn't lie about that kind of thing. You would be found out eventually. I think you're right. I think fraudsters often take advantage of that. Whatever the fraud is, one of the key parts is people are trusting. They want to trust people. They want to believe people, and they hate questioning people. And a lot of times, even if people do question them initially, if the fraudster reacts with kind of insult or anger, that'll get them to back off and they'll just go on with it. I don't know how much of that was going on in the Survivors Network. To this point, they had been duped, but they were duped no longer. When the New York Times told them, like, hey, we reached out to Dave's family, they have no idea who this is. Nobody knows who she is. She never worked for Merrill Lynch. And then her story changes, and it changes dramatically. All of a sudden, she doesn't work in the tower. She was just visiting that day. She wasn't married to Dave. She just knew Dave. This is the story she's telling. And everybody realizes all of this is a lie. And at that point, they remove her from the network and she kind of disappears. The people back in Barcelona have now learned about this. And so the Barcelona people are looking into this. And they essentially confirm what we've told you up to this point, that she was in Barcelona. She was in classes on 9/11. She had told people her arm had been hurt before 9/11. And she had told people different stories actually about how it was hurt. She liked to ride horses. She told people it happened in a horse riding accident. She also told people she was in a really bad car wreck to the point that her arm was actually like severed from her body and then reattached. Knowing Tonia like we do, I bet that didn't happen, but it was never severed. And yeah, she didn't graduate until June 2002, and she'd always told her classmates that her dream was to move to New York and work in New York. And essentially, that's what she did.
I mean, this is such an elaborate lie, Brett. Do you think that she cooked up this entire lie, every aspect of it, and then presented it to the world? Or did it start as almost an innocent lie, like, I want to be a part of a group. Here's a group of people who are so supportive, but then you have to start telling lies to fit in, and it snowballs. Which one do you think it is?
Well, I don't know, actually. Brendan talks about his theory is that she was on their message board and everybody is telling their story about things that happened, and that she kind of watched them and learned from them and was able to craft this story. I mean, the problem, the story is so complete and seemingly without holes, it almost makes you think she had to cook it all up at once. Maybe she added Merrill Lynch on the fly. Maybe somebody asked her, oh, where did you work? And she had to say something, and that would explain why that's the one part of her story that's so obviously wrong. But no, I think she almost had to go into it with all of this packaged and prepared. And, her grand entrance into this group is posting this sort of long description of what happened to her. Now, it seems like she was involved in the group before that. So I guess maybe it's a mixture of both. Maybe she joined the group and then after a little while felt like I need this story. And so she concocted this whole long story and then went with it. I don't know. It would be, if she ever got to a point where she could admit what she did and sort of explain it and walk through it. I mean, that would be a fascinating thing to see.
So we have no idea what Tonia's motive was. So we should also mention that she pretty much disappeared after her lie was unraveled, and she was unseen for about 3 years. And in this documentary, you see that someone sees her on the side of the street and they pull out a camera and she pushes the camera away. So you see a glimpse of her 3 years later. I haven't heard of her since then. That's many years ago at this point. I don't know how someone just disappears yet again. But seeing as she was the woman who wasn't there, maybe this is her specialty. So what caused her to do this? There is this, I don't even know if disorder is the right word, but there's something called I'm going to say it wrong, pseudologia fantastica. And what this is it's chronic lying or storytelling that is unrelated to or completely out of proportion to any clear objective benefit. Here, we have not heard of her telling her story in order to get money to line her own pockets. We don't know that. It seems that she is this support network for everybody else. She's out there giving of herself, volunteering her time, putting events together. Even after she disappears and her lie is unraveled, they go to one of her former friends who's in the Survivors Network, and this friend is planning some big event for the Survivors Network, and it's a lot of work to put these events together. And she says, "I wish Tonia were still here to plan this because she's so good at planning." And I mean, it seemed like she was just giving of herself, and it's not clear how she benefited from this huge lie. And qualitatively, these stories are dramatic, detailed, complicated, colorful, and fantastic, just like Tonia's story. And the stories typically feature the pseudologue as the hero or victim, and they seem geared to achieve acceptance, admiration, and sympathy. I would say that's definitely the case here, Brett. She was trying to, whether it's acceptance or not, acceptance into the group, she certainly got admiration as having one of the worst survivor stories anyone can even imagine. There's this interesting part of her story where she claims that she is getting very depressed and having survivor's guilt. And so she goes into intensive therapy, a type of therapy called flooding, where you relive your terrible moments in life that you are struggling with over and over. So you flood yourself with those memories. And her friend, who was in the network with her, recalled that Tonia would call her night after night, working through this flooding exercise with her friend. And her friend finally had to say, "I can't do this with you. I'm getting too much PTSD from your own flooding exercise. This is too much. I can't handle it." That's how powerful her stories were. She's calling night after night.
Yeah, and I think that's the worst thing she does. I mean, that's like the worst. I mean, she does a lot of bad things, but putting that poor woman who was her best friend in the group through that, I mean, I would like to think that at that point she had lied so much she actually believed it and she was under some sort of self-delusion. But I don't think that's true. I don't think she actually believed it. I think she was still just playing the part.
And I think you've hit the nail on the head that what's so interesting about what I'm describing here is that these types of lies, they lie somewhere on a spectrum between conscious deceit and delusion. I don't know where she falls on that, but it's kind of both. And it's not always, the person's not always conscious of their motives. And they seemingly intermittently believe their stories, yet never reach the level of conviction that would indicate a loss of reality testing. So she clearly knew she was lying, because I would like to think that her conscience took over at Wells's memorial service. So she agreed to attend, she agreed to speak, she even wrote out a speech. But then when it was time for her to stand up and walk up to that podium, she's like, "Oh my goodness, this is bad. I don't know that I can do this."
And that happens a couple times in the documentary.
It happens several times.
Right.
Yeah. There are times where people want to meet with her and learn about people who may have died around her. Their families want to want her to tell them what happened to their loved ones. And she insists that no reporters be there, that it's a very private meeting. And so it doesn't seem like she's looking for that admiration or fame. And so it doesn't seem like she's lost reality.
Right. And, I thought the most striking part of this documentary was when one of the ladies who had gotten close with her talks about her dog and how she's always talking, Tonia is always talking about her dog, Elvis. And this lady would go over to her apartment, and she's a big lover of dogs. And she would say, "Hey, where's your dog?" And Tonia would say, "Oh, she's being walked by the dog walker." And this happened over and over and over again until finally this lady is like, "Do you or do you not have a dog?" And she's like, "Sure, of course I have a dog." And does that level, because obviously she didn't have a dog, and that level of deceit.
Right, but seemingly pointless. Like, what did it matter if she had a dog?
I have no idea.
So we've spent a lot of time talking about this just fantastic story. But we are prosecutors, and we look through lenses of whether laws have been broken. So did she commit a crime? I'm going to jump in here and say I see the potential for charity fraud, but I don't think we have enough information because everyone focuses on her actual lie. So you all may have heard about charity fraud, and typically it's in the context of embezzlement or misdirecting funds. So let's say you solicit funds to cure cancer, but you actually use that money to do something else. Even if it's another philanthropic deed, you're supposed to let your donors know the purpose of their funds. So you can't use the cancer funds to build a new school for, in a poor neighborhood, for example. But oftentimes it's not that philanthropic. Oftentimes people are using the money to buy themselves Rolexes and, nice cars. But there's another aspect of charity fraud, and that is soliciting funds for philanthropic goals with a deceptive manner. Now, I looked on the Survivors Network. It is a 501c3, which means that they filed for the status of nonprofit with the government. You get certain benefits when you're a nonprofit. Tax-exempt status. You may know that whenever you donate to a 501c3, you can write it off on your taxes. So I know that the network is a nonprofit organization and gets those benefits, which means that they can solicit donations and people get tax breaks for doing so. Now, I can imagine that Tonia, as the president of the network, probably had a lot to do. That's usually the top job for the president, is to fundraise for your nonprofit. We know that she met with lots of dignitaries. She was the face of the network. Her story was prominently told and displayed for the network. Now, whether you can show that people gave because of her story, I'm not sure, because I don't think it's ever been investigated from that angle. But you can see how this is primed for charity fraud. Now, that's not very sexy because you're not really going after her lie. Is there any lie that's a crime for Harvard or Merrill Lynch or for Wells's family or for Dave's family, for that matter?
I have a couple thoughts on that. The first would be, I wonder if the Survivors Network or Dave's family could sue her for intentional infliction of emotional distress, just given how much pain this would have caused them.
I hadn't thought about that before, but that is, you're right that those are typically really difficult to show. You try to tie them typically with some financial harm because it's so difficult to show the emotional harm in court, but it doesn't mean you can't show it. And this seems like such an egregious example that if you were to have a test case, I would say this falls right into it. I would try to bring that case.
One thing, if you wanted to do it from the Survivors Network point of view, I bet they had a drop off in donations the next year. I bet this caused a lot of people to look askance at the network. I mean, you could probably try and tie that in as your financial damages. The other question I would have, and I don't know the answer to this, but you might. Obviously, reputation has value. If you ever, dig into a merger between two companies, reputation is often valued, and they put like an actual value on what you're getting by bringing that company's reputation into your own company. Obviously, her involvement with the network dramatically increased her reputation and the value of her reputation. I mean, this was before things like influencers, but you could imagine today if Tonia Head were the head of the Survivors Network, even if she wasn't making any money directly from that, every Instagram post with her millions of followers would have resulted in value for her. Do you think those kind of things could be used as a basis for fraud?
Potentially. So when you talk about reputational harm, that's usually the effect of breaking a law like defamation, libel, or slander. And in this case, she doesn't defame anybody. So it's an interesting thing. But, on a quick search, this would probably be at the state level when you look at reputational harm. And I chuckle a little bit because the only state I see where potentially you could bring a suit for reputational harm is California. And I chuckle because California has actually a very active, they're one of the few states where almost anyone can bring a lawsuit for anything. It's written into their constitution to allow basically a very litigious state. And so I don't know of any successful cases in California, but it looks like you potentially could bring a reputational harm case. Now, again, like I was noting earlier, what would be the damages? And by damages, I mean, what do you get out of the lawsuit if you win? It's not clear if it's not tied to financial harm.
Right. I guess I'm asking more on the fraud side. I mean, typically, like you said, if you're going to charge fraud, you have to prove some sort of financial benefit flowed to you from the fraud. I don't know if that's always true, but I think it almost always is. And so I was just wondering if you can value sort of her exposure and the fact that she was gaining all this fame, if that was like something you could value in a way that you could point to that as financial gain for the basis of a fraud charge.
I think technically you probably could, but practically and politically probably not. Can you imagine people taking money away from 9/11 causes because one person lied? Politically it would be probably untenable to do so. So I think technically, yes.
And I think this goes to something that you hear a lot. Just because something's immoral doesn't mean it's illegal. Just something is wrong doesn't necessarily mean there's a legal recourse for it. And another factor we haven't mentioned is the First Amendment. And the First Amendment plays a role in these kind of cases. I mean, one reason that you typically have to have some sort of financial gain is you have a right in this country to lie. There are cases called stolen valor cases. So, as you may know, in the wake of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, there were a lot of people who claimed to be, Navy SEALs, or they had combat experience, or they were wounded, and they would, wear uniforms and have medals and everything else. And it turned out, they were never in the military. They've never left Saskatoon or whatever. And there was an effort to charge these people and to pass laws to make this illegal. And a lot of those laws have actually been struck down as in violation of the First Amendment because, as despicable as it might be, you have freedom of speech and you have the right to say things that aren't true unless you can prove some sort of concrete harm to someone else.
Brett, that's a great example. I think this is probably the closest to the Stolen Valor Act. And just in case you guys are interested in looking up that case, the Supreme Court case that struck down the Stolen Valor Act of 2013 is United States versus Alvarez. And the Supreme Court ruled that the arrest and prosecution of a citizen who wears these unearned military awards, who does so without a criminal intent. So kind of like what we think Tonia did, is they didn't really gain a benefit. They just wanted to wear these awards. It violates their constitutional right to freedom of speech, of the First Amendment.
I think at the end of the day, a sort of social opprobrium is all you've got with somebody like Tonia, who everybody says, she never made money off this. She, to our knowledge, she got no concrete benefit from it whatsoever. And in fact, it seems like it actually cost her money because, as bizarre as this may seem, she poured a lot of time, a lot of energy. She rented office space, just to, do this work with this organization that she was lying to. It's a fascinating story. It's a crazy story. It's one that, like I said, I just feel like people don't know, and they need to know it because it is mind-blowing. And the documentary is a stunning documentary, and I hope all you guys will check it out.
So at the end of the day, there may be things that are just shocks the conscience for all of us. It may not actually violate the law. And to some degree, I think that's good. We don't need a law to dictate every aspect of our life.
I think that's exactly right. We don't need that. As horrible as this was, I think at the end of the day, things kind of worked out the way they should. She was exposed. She was removed from this organization. And as far as I know, she's just sort of faded into oblivion, which I think for her might be, one of the worst possible punishments. Well, Alice, I think that's all I've got on Tonia Head. Do you have anything else you want to add for the audience before we move on to the next week?
No, I hope you've enjoyed this. This is kind of a slightly different take on true crime, but it's a fascinating story and one of many stories like this out there, I'm sure. But this one's now been uncovered.
Yeah, I hope you guys, if you know some stories like this, let us know. We'll share them on a future question and answer episode. Let us know what you think. Our email address is prosecutorspod@gmail.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram @prosecutorspod. And then obviously you can check out our website where we'll have links to stories about Tonia Head and links to that documentary as well, and links to some psychological studies on this, potential mental illness. But we'll be back next week with a new crime, new questions, and hopefully some new answers. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. And in 2007, she actually invites a filmmaker, Angelo Guglielmo. Guglielmo?
Sorry, Angelo.
Guglielmo? Yeah, Angelo Guglielmo. Okay, what do you think it is? Angelo Guglielmo.
I think you got it right. I think that's right. It looks like, or Guglielmo.
Filmmaker.
That's just phonetic. I'm just reading what I see. Who doesn't love a good Elmo?
Tragedy. It's
I'm really sorry, Angelo. I respect your work.
Cry, right? Okay. It's a great documentary. Anyways.
If you're looking to streamline your audio advertising buys and maximize your revenue, look no further than Triton Digital's programmatic audio advertising exchange, A2X. The private exchange consists of only licensed broadcasters and top-tier internet radio publishers, assuring the quality inventory and brand safety you can trust. Visit www.tritondigital.com to learn more.